Andy Griffith, an enduring television star of the 1960s and 80s, died early Tuesday at his home in North Carolina and was laid to rest nearby.
He was America's sheriff, the man who made an entire nation believe in a small town called Mayberry, where problems were solved with patience and a kind word. For more than 50 years, Andy Griffith was as familiar as a member of your own family. So when he died on the morning of July 3, 2012, the world expected a grand farewell, a funeral worthy of a legend. Instead, by lunchtime that same day, before most of America even knew he was gone, Andy Griffith was already in the ground, buried on his own property in under 5 hours. No public funeral, no procession, no goodbye. And for years, people whispered that something was wrong. The truth is stranger and far more deliberate than any conspiracy. The morning everything happened too fast. On the evening of July 2, 2012, Andy Griffith fell gravely ill at his home on Roanoke Island on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. He was 86 years old, and he made a choice that tells you something about the man. He refused to go to the hospital. Instead, he gathered his closest friends and family around him and said his goodbyes. His wife of nearly 30 years, Cindy, was at his side. There was no frantic ambulance ride, no team of doctors fighting to keep him alive in a sterile hospital room. He chose to spend his final hours in his own home, on the island he loved, with the people he cared about most. And in the early hours of the next morning, July 3rd, at around 7 a.m., Andy Griffith died. The cause was a heart attack, complicated by underlying health issues, including hypertension and coronary artery disease that had troubled him for years. What happened next is the part that stunned the country. By 11:30 that same morning, just 4.5 hours after he took his last breath, Andy Griffith's body was lowered into a grave on his own property. No public viewing, no days of lying in state, no funeral that fans or even distant friends could attend. There was no embalming, no elaborate preparation, no waiting period of any kind. A funeral home representative confirmed the timeline to the press, lowered into the ground by 11:30 in the morning, on the same day he died. For most people, the news of Andy Griffith's death and the news of his burial arrived at almost the exact same moment. By the time America learned that its beloved sheriff was gone, he was already buried. The speed of it was so far outside the normal order of things that people immediately began to ask the obvious question: what was the rush? What were they hiding? The answer would not come from a press release. It would come, years later, from the pages of a biography and the testimony of the people who were actually there. The whisper of conspiracy. When a beloved public figure is buried before most of the world even knows they have died, people talk. And in the case of Andy Griffith, the theories started almost immediately. Some wondered if there was something suspicious about the cause of death itself. Why no autopsy? Why no public examination? Others pointed to the fact that he was buried on private property, in a location the family refused to disclose, and asked what could possibly require that level of secrecy. A few even questioned the role of his third wife, Cindy, who was the sole person at his bedside and who handled the arrangements. The executive director of the state's Funeral Directors Association, a man named Larry Stegall, who had been in the business for 32 years, admitted that he had never seen anything like it. He said he could not recall ever having heard of a burial happening so fast. He explained that the normal practice would have been to wait several days, giving extended family and friends time to travel, to view the body, to mourn together in the traditional way. None of that happened for Andy Griffith. That admission, from a veteran funeral director who had handled countless deaths, poured fuel on the speculation. If a man with 3 decades of experience had never seen a burial this rushed, then surely something unusual was going on. It is worth pausing here to clear up one thing, because it matters. What Andy Griffith did was completely legal. In North Carolina, home burial on private property is permitted. The state does not require embalming. It does not require a vault or a commercial casket. As long as a death certificate is properly completed and the local requirements are met, a family can bury a loved one on their own land. So nothing about the burial broke any law. The speed was unusual, even shocking, but it was entirely within Andy Griffith's rights as a private landowner in North Carolina. And here is the truth. Something unusual was going on, but it was not a crime. It was not a cover-up. It was a plan. A plan that Andy Griffith himself had put in place long before he died, for a reason that says everything about the kind of life he had lived and the kind of death he wanted. To understand it, you have to understand what Andy Griffith was afraid of. The thing he feared more than death. Andy Griffith spent more than half a century as one of the most recognizable men in America. And with that level of fame came a price that he came to despise. The cameras, the crowds, the relentless intrusion of a public that felt it owned a piece of him. He had watched what happened when famous people died. He had seen the circus, the helicopters hovering over private homes, the photographers climbing fences and trees to get a single shot of a casket, the crowds of strangers turning a family's most private grief into a public spectacle. He had seen funerals become media events, with news crews broadcasting live and tabloids paying for forbidden photographs. And Andy Griffith decided, while he was still alive and in full control of his faculties, that none of that would happen to him. According to the biography written by Daniel de Vizay, who had unique access to the Griffith family, Andy had already determined exactly what he did not want. He did not want helicopters over his home. He did not want press coverage of his death. He did not want swarming crowds trying to catch a glimpse of his casket. So he asked a small group of trusted friends to do something specific, to bury him immediately after his death, before the paparazzi could storm Roanoke Island and capture his remains on film. That is the real reason, not a conspiracy, not a cover-up. A man who had given the public 50 years of himself, and who wanted the one thing that fame had always denied him: privacy, a quiet, dignified exit on his own terms in the ground of the island he loved, before the outside world could turn it into a show. But carrying out that plan required more than just a willing family. It required the help of an entire community. And what they did to protect him is one of the most remarkable parts of this whole story. The sheriff who grounded the helicopters. Here is a detail that most tellings of this story leave out entirely, and it is the part that makes the whole thing feel like something out of one of Andy Griffith's own scripts. When Andy died and the plan went into motion, the people of Dare County, North Carolina, closed ranks around him. These were his neighbors, the local people of Roanoke Island, where he had lived for years, who knew him not as a television star, but as a man who lived among them. And they understood exactly what he wanted. According to de Vizay's account, the local sheriff took an extraordinary step. He grounded helicopters in the area to keep camera crews away from the Griffith estate. Think about the poetry of that for a moment. Andy Griffith, the man who played the most famous fictional sheriff in American history, was protected in death by a real sheriff who used his authority to keep the cameras at bay. The fictional lawman of Mayberry, shielded by an actual lawman doing exactly what Sheriff Andy Taylor would have done, protecting one of his own. The community did its part. The helicopters stayed on the ground. The camera crews never got their shot. And Andy Griffith was laid to rest in peace, exactly as he had asked. But that hectic, compressed timetable came at a genuine cost, and it fell hardest on the people who loved him most. Because the same speed that kept the paparazzi away also kept his own family from saying goodbye. The daughter who could not say goodbye. The most heartbreaking consequence of Andy Griffith's rushed burial is one that almost no video about this story mentions. His only surviving child was not there. Andy Griffith had 2 children from his first marriage, both adopted. His son, Andy Samuel Griffith Jr., known as Sam, had struggled with addiction for much of his life, and died in 1996 at the age of 37. The loss devastated his father. Sam had battled alcoholism and the demons that came with growing up as the son of one of the most famous men in America, and his early death was a wound that Andy carried for the rest of his life. That left his daughter, Dixie Griffith, as his only surviving child. And when her father was buried, just 4.5 hours after his death, Dixie could not get there in time. The timetable was simply too fast. By the time the news could even reach everyone who needed to know, the burial was already happening or already done. His lone surviving child could not attend her own father's burial. Years later, Dixie spoke about it. She did not express anger. She understood why it had happened. She confirmed the very reason behind it, saying that her father did not want a funeral, he did not want a circus, and he did not want a media frenzy. She understood his wishes completely, but she also expressed her regret at not being able to be there, at not being able to stand at his graveside and say goodbye to the man who had raised her. There is a particular kind of grief in understanding completely why you were left out of something, and still wishing with all your heart that you had been included. It is a quietly devastating detail. In his determination to avoid a public spectacle, Andy Griffith created a private burial so swift and so closed that even his own daughter was left out of it. The plan worked perfectly. The cameras never came. But the cost was that some of the people who loved him most never got their moment of farewell. And the rapid burial was only the first of the controversies that would surround Andy Griffith's death. Because what happened to his property in the year that followed would anger his friends and reveal tensions that the public had never seen. The house that disappeared. About a year after Andy Griffith died, his widow, Cindy, made a decision that infuriated some of his oldest friends. Andy had owned a small home on Roanoke Island that he had purchased back in the 1950s. It was a place full of history, a piece of his life from the era when he was first becoming a star. According to friends, Andy had told people that he would have liked to see that house preserved and turned into a museum, a place where fans could come and connect with his legacy. Instead, in 2013, Cindy obtained a demolition permit from Dare County and had the house torn down. The little piece of history was simply gone. Friends who had hoped to see it preserved were angry and dismayed. A tangible connection to Andy Griffith's life had been erased. This decision, combined with the rapid burial and the fact that Cindy had been the sole person at his bedside and had inherited his estate, fueled an undercurrent of tension that lingered for years. Some of Andy's friends felt that his final wishes, at least regarding the house, had not been honored. Others defended Cindy, pointing out that she had been his devoted partner for nearly 30 years, the love of his life, and that she had every right to make decisions about her own property and her own grief. The truth is that family situations after a death are almost always more complicated than the public ever sees. What is clear is that Cindy was acting, at least in the matter of the burial, on a plan that Andy himself had created. In her statement after his death, she spoke about the core of who he was, describing him as a person of incredibly strong Christian faith who was prepared for the day he would be called home to his Lord. And that faith is the final piece of the puzzle, the thing that ties the entire story together. A man at peace. To truly understand why Andy Griffith was buried so quickly, you have to understand that he was not afraid of death. He had made his peace with it long before it came. Andy Griffith was a deeply religious man. He had grown up singing gospel hymns as a boy at Grace Moravian Church in his hometown of Mount Airy, North Carolina. In 1997, he won a Grammy Award for an album of gospel hymns called I Love to Tell the Story, returning to the music of his childhood faith. That faith was not a performance. It was the foundation of his life, and it shaped how he approached his own death. His wife said it plainly. Andy was prepared for the day he would be called home. He did not fear it. He did not need an elaborate funeral to mark his passing, because in his belief, death was not an ending, but a homecoming. He had no need for the pomp and ceremony that surrounds so many celebrity deaths. He wanted to go quietly, into the earth of the island he loved, surrounded only by the people closest to him, with his God and his peace. By the time Andy died, he had already buried many of the people who had defined his life. His best friend and on-screen partner Don Knotts, who played the beloved Deputy Barney Fife, had died in 2006. The two had been close for decades, and Andy had visited Don in his final days, their friendship lasting long after the cameras stopped rolling. He had lost his son Sam in 1996. He had outlived so much of the world that made him who he was. For a man of his faith, at 86 years old, having said his goodbyes the night before and made peace with his God, death was not something to be feared or delayed. It was simply the next step home. So when you put it all together, the rushed burial was never a mystery at all. It was the final deliberate act of a private man who had spent his whole life giving himself to the public, and who reclaimed, in his death, the one thing the public had always taken from him. He chose the island over the spotlight. He chose privacy over spectacle. He chose to be buried as a man, not displayed as a celebrity. The sheriff grounded the helicopters. The community protected him. And Andy Griffith, the man who taught America what a good and decent life looked like, was laid to rest exactly the way he wanted. Quietly, quickly, and on his own terms. The grave remains on private property to this day. There is no marker for tourists to visit, no public site where fans can gather, no headstone that the curious can photograph. The exact location was never disclosed to the press, and the family has kept it that way ever since. In an age where the resting places of the famous are catalogued online, mapped, and turned into pilgrimage sites, Andy Griffith managed to do something almost impossible. He disappeared completely into the quiet earth of the island he loved, leaving no trail for the outside world to follow. If you want to honor Andy Griffith, you cannot go to his grave. Instead, you go to Mount Airy, the real-life town in the foothills of North Carolina that inspired the fictional Mayberry. It is a place that has embraced its connection to him completely. You can visit the Andy Griffith Museum, home to the single largest collection of memorabilia from his life and career. Hundreds of items spanning his work in theater, film, music, and television. You can tour the town in a replica of Deputy Barney Fife's squad car. You can see the modest house where Andy grew up before he ever became a star. And every year, the town hosts Mayberry Days, a festival that draws fans from all over the country to celebrate the show and the values it represented. At the center of it all stands a bronze statue, an 800-pound likeness of Sheriff Andy Taylor walking to the fishing hole, fishing poles over their shoulders, his young son Opie at his side. Father and son, frozen forever in that perfect, peaceful image of a simpler America. When the statue was unveiled back in 2003, Andy himself was there to see it. And in his typical understated way, he looked at the monument to his most famous character and simply said, "That beats anything." That statue is where the world remembers him. The smiling sheriff, the patient father, the man who made an entire nation believe in the goodness of small-town life. But the man himself, the private person behind the beloved character, rests somewhere quiet on Roanoke Island, in a spot known only to the few who loved him most. Exactly where he wanted to be. Finally, and forever, out of the spotlight. And maybe that is the most fitting ending of all. The world keeps the sheriff. The island keeps the man. Andy Griffith spent 50 years belonging to everyone. In death, he finally belonged only to himself. The 4-hour burial was not a conspiracy or a cover-up. It was one last act of a man who valued peace over spectacle, and who got to leave this world exactly the way he came into Mayberry. Quietly, humbly, and on his own terms. If you liked this, hit like and subscribe, and make sure to check out our other videos.